Importantly, we want to hear from the business leaders from the various countries, from all of you here, to have a discussion about this important issue.
As you know, this is an organisational group without any precedent in history. No major business group has ever got together like this with a single purpose of defeating modern slavery in our region. You are here as complete pioneers in the battle to defeat modern slavery. The worst scourge against human rights and unchecked will grow worse again in the modern world. We have 30 million lives to change just in our region alone, leaders. 45 million across the world, and this is only as we measure now. The fact we're gathering has huge import and will inform the global strategy which gets rolled out at United Nations Week in September. And government knows that there's approximately $750 billion of supply chains annually in this room. It's no exaggeration. Government is aware that we represent many hundreds of thousands of employees. And business cannot front-run government because they make the rules. To front-run them would be to break them. But government is also terrified of front-running business. Business needs to show the leadership as to what we want, the standards we expect our government to set, so that we can pursue those standards and adhere to them. Ladies and gentlemen, we can inform our governments and we can act ourselves to the standards which we set this afternoon. And we can drive modern slavery out of the Indo-Pacific, and when that occurs, we will drive it out of the world. And the world itself will be a much more peaceful and a much more prosperous place for our children to grow up in. And that is our challenge this afternoon, fellow leaders. So I leave it with you. Thank you.
Grace, you and I share something with your remarkable mother and father, which is a passion about eliminating the evil of slavery. And if human history is that long, it's really only the last half inch where freedom has been real for countless millions of people. This remarkable man here led the initial charge against slavery, and yet we hardly ever hear of him. Can you tell us a bit about him? You're working and studying in London, and like me, you think he was one of the great writers of freedom for our age. Tell us about him.
I do. I think William Wilberforce is really a father of freedom for humanity. Not only was he absolutely shocked and decided that he would not allow for human beings to be traded as commodities, despite the fact he was in a society where that was actually accepted, but he also fought for the freedom of animals. He also fought for women to have a say, to be able to vote. He did so many things that meant that in today's society, there's a fairer playing field. It's not fair, but because of him, it's a lot better than it could have been. I think the slavery story, you know, sadly we're here today because there are still some 45 million slaves in the world today. But what the number would be without someone like William Wilberforce is absolutely unbelievable. Because what happened was the hierarchy of society, where one society was able to benefit and build themselves off the back of another, off the back of saying that one human being is not just less, but is a commodity to serve our best interests. And he said, no.
If you wanted to be responsible, you'd have said, there is a retail industry, there's a consumer industry which is turning a blind eye, there's governments which know this is going on and ignore it. As William Wilberforce said, fantastic quote, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again you did not know.
Interesting really that he was a fantastically wealthy man in his own right. He was seen as a future Prime Minister, he was a brilliant speaker, he had everything going for him. And he put his reputation on the line and it was trashed for decades while he fought and fought and fought. He was a very brave and courageous man. He never gave up.
No, some 70 failures of going forward. I think we had an amazing question today that said, you know, do you ever fail in this work? Do you ever stumble? Every single day we learn from failure, and we literally stand on the shoulders of giants who gave his life to fight that legal battle to say that all men should be equal.
Remarkable story, really, and one that we ought to know. Churchill wrote in 1933, he was a great defender of freedom. In many ways, this was the bloke who invented freedom for us, he and his friends. Churchill wrote that if any society that doesn't teach its children the story of religious faith and its heroes is saying that that culture is null and void, and it leaves young people unable to sort of work out a good direction. I think it's a great pity we don't know more about him, and we ought to know more about him because he's airbrushed out of our history. And all this was happening when Australia was a very young country just setting out. It's incredible to think that our culture kept slaves until long after Australia was settled.
No, it really is unbelievable. I think the moral compass of a society, there's no way that we can galvanise a future without understanding the past.
I agree with that.
And without understanding there are terrible things that have happened throughout human history, and the heroes, what they stood up for and what they stood against was far greater than what we do now.
And yet the truth is that often now we denigrate history. People keep crying out. You know, I was in politics for a long time. They say, we want leaders to take us to a better place. You can't know where to go to if you don't know where you are, and you'll never work out where you are if you don't know where you've come from. Well, Chris, after a pretty distinguished career in the Federal Parliament, on the other side politically from me, you're now doing a fascinating work about which both of us, I think, would speak passionately about the need to be engaged in. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think modern slavery is an issue that everyone can get behind. No one is going to go out there and articulate a pro-slavery stance. But I think there's not a lot of understanding about how many people are in slavery or slave-like conditions in the world. And what I found working in Australia on the issue is that it's a bipartisan response. It's not a left or a right issue. It's an issue where everyone knows we have to do better. And what we know is governments haven't solved the problem on their own. And that's why we're trying to enlist business and the community in the effort, because we've passed good laws throughout the Asia-Pacific region, and they're not working, they're not delivering results. So we need to do more, and I think bringing the forces of business, bringing the forces of the community will allow us to end what is this terrible evil and that inflicts so many people in the world.
I have two things to say. One is a statement and the other is a request. The statement is absolute support to Mr. Forrest and Eddie, your initiative. Every day we see thousands, if not millions, of Sri Lankans being used in the most deplorable, atrocious manner, particularly in the Gulf. We see the results of this mistreatment in our villages, amongst our families, and we just can't take it anymore. And the result is abject corruption in our government, and successive governments that prevents our people from staying back home and working for our nation. We want to take a stand against it, and we are very proud to be a part of this movement and this initiative. And whatever support that as a company we can provide for you, I'm here to tell you that we will take that stand with you. And also, a request from each of you, as we take a stand against the atrocities committed against our people, stand with us. Thank you.
It was outlawed as a result of the extraordinary work of people like Wilberforce, then of course the Civil War in America. It's now an illegal trade. Nobody, as you say, will own the idea that slavery is a good idea, and yet it flourishes to an extraordinary degree. To think that double the population of Australia in the world today, some nearly between 45 and 50 million people are slaves, is an extraordinary thing.
Yes, and I think people need to understand, in part it's a product of globalisation. Globalisation has done tremendous things for developing countries and the people in them, as it's provided opportunities for economic growth and the development of those countries, and their people therefore have received increased standards of living and other benefits. But as part of globalisation, we've had this race to produce cheaper goods. We've had global companies competing with each other, moving their supply chains to places where they get cheaper labour. And unfortunately, that's spilt over now where there are no minimum standards. into exploitation of people in our global supply chains, and the goods we consume, the food we eat, as they exploit people who are supplying the early part of that production chain. So globalisation has been a fantastic benefit to many places, but one of the hidden impacts has been this support for economic slavery in those global production chains. So we've got the traditional exploitation of people that might be based on cultural or other national or country reasons, but we've now got this economic driver, and that's why we've got to get business involved, because if Australians actually knew that the fish they were eating, that the t-shirts they were wearing were actually being made in part by slaves, they'd regard that as abhorrent. But they don't get that visibility, and that's why we've got to work at raising the issue more broadly.
Really, if you look at modern slavery, essentially I mostly deal with supply chain, formal supply chain, therefore I'm dealing with migrant labourers. They're in legal systems with government processes. Of course, as a German-based headquartered company, there's a lot of attention at the moment, obviously with the refugee crisis in Europe, and this has become even more apparent in terms of considering risk in more localized supply chains. So again, traditionally the belief was the issues are in Asia or in Africa or something, but the reality is they're actually on the doorstep of every business, no matter where you're located.
There's this thing around our world these days called capitalism, which is probably one of the driving forces behind this. And it was interesting to understand that you both yourself and Andrew talked about the actual cost of change wasn't that much in your organisations, probably because people down the supply chain are actually taking all the money at the expense of those workers who weren't really getting what they deserve. And it's breaking up that supply chain and overcoming these barriers and these issues that is part of the process.
It was only a very brief one. The previous speaker just twigged me to a little bit of history that I think is very illustrative, and that is that slavery has traditionally been built into the economics of supply chains, been a very major factor. And nowhere was that more the case than in the African slave trade out of the UK, which was being so vigorously opposed at about the time that this country became a country or was settled. And it's interesting to note that in 1833, when slavery was finally abolished by Britain and therefore throughout the British Empire, massive, massive government compensation was paid. Not to the former slaves, but to the former slave owners, because it had been legal. It massively damaged the Exchequer's problems. Britain's debt to GDP ratio at the time, after the Napoleonic Wars, was well over 200%. And this took it even higher. But the interesting thing was that although it's estimated that it slowed economic growth in Britain for something like 80 years, Britain went on to become an economic powerhouse nonetheless. It's just an interesting reflection. Sometimes doing the right thing can cost some money, and yes, it'll be opposed by business, but it actually resulted in a far better economic outcome for that great superpower.
Thank you, sir. Leaders in this room, we must stand together. We must be able to say strongly, we suspect we have slavery in our supply chains, we're out to prove it so that we can root it out. Because the statistics say we have. We're too big a community to not have slavery in our supply chains, so we know it's there. But together, if one of us falls because we don't stand together, then we all fail.
As you know, Chris, I wrote a piece on this in support of the incredible work that the Forrest family and his team, yourself included, are doing in this area. And it's often interesting then to watch the online commentary. There are a lot of people there who are sympathetic to the cause, but as I read them through, I realised there's very little understanding, incredibly little understanding of what modern slavery might look like and how, in fact, unwittingly, we're nearly all involved in it.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a problem with the terminology, because modern slavery is a fairly new term, and it's been used to try and provide a catch-all for the various forms of slavery that exist, from human trafficking, from bonded labour, from child labour to sexual exploitation, sexual servitude. And so it serves that purpose. But if you say to someone, oh, we want you to do something about human trafficking or sexual servitude, they, oh, I get that. But when you say modern slavery, it's a term they're not used to yet. And I think sometimes you have to break it down so people really understand what that term means.
When people hear modern slavery, often they feel confused. They think you're talking about something in a historical term that you're rephrasing, or maybe they understand the term human trafficking. But the fact is, human trafficking is just one facet of what modern slavery is. And modern slavery is different to the slavery we saw in the time of William Wilberforce. But of course, at its essence, it is the same. It is the systematic removal of a person's freedom in order for another person's gain, financial gain, whichever it might be. And I feel very strongly that any work that's done on a government level, influencing policy, working with business leaders, can't be done without the voice of the people in the room. And sometimes it can be very difficult to take a survivor with you everywhere you go, but we feel very strongly that bringing these stories along with us is essential to remembering why we're here. It's about human life.
You've uncovered and you've personally gone and experienced the stories or interacted with the lives of people, including children, who are still caught in this terrible vice.
So this is Sarah. She is a Syrian refugee living in a refugee camp in Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley. Right. So one of the oldest conflict zones in the world. And what I find fascinating about this is that for many people, when they imagine slavery, we seem to put some kind of old-fashioned label on it. We imagine them to look a certain way or be a certain way. And of course, this isn't true. There are slaves in every country, from every ethnic background. But Sarah is Syrian, but just the way we physically look, we could be sisters. She's got blonde hair, she's got blue eyes and fair skin, as do I. Except the difference is that when I was her age, I was in a home where there was food on the table, where I was sent to school, where my education was valued equally to my brother's, as opposed she lives in a refugee camp with very little prospects, and in order to feed her siblings, she has to work. Now, child labour is a terrible thing, but sometimes a necessary evil to be a bridging gap between people literally being able to meet their basic needs. What becomes even sadder in this situation is when those children are then taken away from their families, who don't speak the local language, who can't go and get them because they're confined to a refugee camp, and then go missing into brothels in the area, into a complex supply chain somewhere else, sometimes even organ trafficking. So forced labour around these camps, the relationship between distress migration and between displacement and exploitation and slavery is unbelievable. So really, if you want to talk about slavery or be a passionate modern abolitionist, we need to care about our most vulnerable people because they are the ones going in.
But you mentioned there that ordinary people can make a difference.
Yeah.
It's interesting to note that back in the time of Wilberforce, the women of England who ran the households at one stage stopped buying sugar because it was produced by slaves. Direct action, they were into the business of saying, we're going to go
without having a vote, they were his vote en masse. And I think that's what's incredible. I think in a society where they were literally silenced and they definitely did not have a seat at the table, they still made a stand that made a significant difference and impact on change makers. And I think perhaps we can relate that to a consumer in today's society, or even a young person that looks at the state of the world and thinks, oh my goodness, how on earth do I buy into making a difference? And the truth is, 45.8 million slaves is an incredibly overwhelming number.
Mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling.
Twice the population of Australia.
And the truth is, sir, that's a conservative estimate.
Yeah.
So,
and 2/3 of it in our region.
2/3 of it in our backyard. And the fact is, yes, it is far removed, and yes, I have done some dangerous work on the ground, and not everyone can do that. But when we think modern slavery is far away from us, we're so wrong. It's in the tea we buy every day. It's in the clothes we wear. It might even physically be in a beauty salon near you or in a fruit picking district. In Australia, there are some 4,300 people living in slavery right now. But our consumer power affects global supply chains. We feed into that. And yes, we may only have one voice in doing that, but the Walk Free Foundation has demonstrated that collective people power is the strongest thing we've got. We have run campaigns against quite a few companies that we started by, addressing the board or meeting with the CEO behind closed doors and saying, we have found a significant issue of human rights within your supply chain. We'd love to help you amend it. We've got a team of experts at your service, and they said, thank you, we're not interested. And we'd try this maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 times, and then we'd say, okay, we tried to do this diplomatically, and then we'd take it to a massive Facebook base of young people passionate about seeing change. So one example that I can disclose today is Zara, which is a very famous clothing label. Yep. And they were using all slave-picked cotton from Uzbekistan. We had 70,000 people write letters to the CEO about conditions within their supply chain. We had hundreds of people show up to stores on one day. We just wanted them to go in and ask the question, is there slavery in supply chains? Instead, these kids were standing out the front of stores yelling at people going in saying there is slavery in this supply chain. And suddenly, not so hard to be able to re-talk about this. And now, that company has no slave-picked cotton from Uzbekistan, and they do a fantastic job. They often are not even aware of these situations.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, they're often not.
No.
But how fantastic to do something worthwhile like that, because a lot of what happens on social media is just cruel and unnecessary, and yet these things can be used for powerful good. Whereas these things are unpacked, Australians might like information that would let them make wise choices as well, to send very powerful signals to people that they don't want to be involved in a chain that's locked slaves up.
No, and I think that's why you're seeing many leading businesses actually saying this is good business decisions. So while we might be able to get a good cheaper, it's not sustainable. It's not a sustainable business model. We know our customers and we know our investors don't want to be associated with these things. So there's the big ethical investment push occurring as well. So companies, smart companies, are going, not only is it morally the right thing to do, but it's good business. And their employees support action on it, so it's good for retention of employees. So there's a lot of benefits that flow to a business who can say they're actually tackling the issue seriously. So I think that's an awareness we need to build, that just being able to get the cheapest contract, which might be at the expense of exploiting people, is not actually a sustainable business model.
Grace, that's a very powerful story, and it ought to motivate the best in us to step up. It's very easy to fall for the modern Western value that it's all about me. I actually reckon we find ourselves when we seek to make a difference for others who haven't had the privileges that we have.
Well, yeah, we're some of the most privileged. I'm obviously a very privileged person, but everyone that lives in Australia is privileged. Everyone that had parents that loved them or had an ability to go to school is a great privilege. I think often people say, a lot of young people are selfish or disengaged. I'm actually not sure that's true. I think a lot of people feel hopeless. They don't know how to engage in change. They feel overwhelmed by the tides of these incredible injustices going on in our world. And the fact is, I can't speak about every issue going on, but with modern slavery, I can say with absolute certainty that our individual consumer choices matter. Our collective choices matter. I've been at local primary schools in WA just this year who have decided to become fair trade schools, who had a fair trade Easter fair to make sure there was no slave-made chocolate in their Easter bunny run. These kids are 9 years old. Talk about modern slavery, they handle it better than adults because they see injustice as what it is. They don't complicate it. They say that's not fair and I'm not going to stand for it.
The only final comment I'd make is we need to be a little bit careful, as someone at this meeting said, that you don't fall into a false view when sometimes people are doing it tough, but it is reasonably fair and they need that work to get out of poverty.
Well, yeah, I think there is definitely a champagne socialist view of, take domestic migrant workers, for example. They probably 8 to 9 times out of 10 end up in situations of exploitation. I have sat with these women in Jordan. I have heard them cry about horrific, unbelievable situations. And when I hold their hands and say to them, did you know that you might be locked in a bedroom and never able to leave, or you might be sexually abused by your employer? They say, yes, I did know that, but I have to feed my kids. Yeah. I knew that maybe there was a 50% chance that would happen to me, but I have to feed my kids. I have to look after my mum who's in hospital. My husband's got a debt back home. And the fact is, what we need to do is understand that there is great inequality in our global economies. People do need to be able to work to meet their basic needs. And what we need to do is make sure that work is safe and fair, wherever possible. It doesn't need to be perfect, but one, people need to have an ability to leave. That's what slavery defines. People have no ability to leave their place of work, and people need to be respected with basic dignity. But absolutely, it's not going to be perfect. Definitely not. Even in Sarah's situation, You know, if she doesn't work, she doesn't eat. And I would love for her to not be able to work, but if we can give informal education in those camp conditions, then at least she's not stuck in that frame of mind. If we try and go to the end goal and we start here, we'll never jump from there to there. But if we can go every degree forward, at least the journey can start taking place.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you very much.